All right, we're live. So, today we're studying Genesis chapter 38. If you're just joining us, Bible study is every Wednesday at 5 o'clock California time. I'll be reading from the World English Bible. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat. The box is on your right. So, let's get started. So this story here in chapter 38, it takes us away from the Joseph story. We've been reading about Joseph. He's just been sold as a slave into Egypt. And all of a sudden, we just take a break from that story. And there's really no explanation for why we have this. And it's kind of a strange placement for it because it's kind of fast forwarding in the life of Judah as well. This is not happening at the same time. This is happening sometime later. And at the end of this Judah story, we go back to Joseph when he's 17. So it's out of order, it's out of place, and it invites us to wonder, why is it here? What is so important about it being right here, right now? So let's dig into the text and see what we can discern about that. So it says, at that time, Judah went down from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hirah. There, Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite man named Shua. He took her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him She conceived again and bore a son, and she named him Onan. She yet again bore a son and named him Shelah. He was at Hezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord killed him. Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. Onan knew that the offspring wouldn't be his. So here we're talking about an obscure cultural practice, right? When a sibling died and they left behind a wife, it was the duty of the next sibling to marry that wife and to bear children. And those offspring aren't his offspring because their job is to grow up and take care of their mother. So the idea behind this is that if you marry into a family, you will always be taken care of. At least that's the idea behind it. Did that always work out that way? Probably not, So here we see how it doesn't work out that way. She conceived again and bore a son, Onan. Oh, I'm sorry, I've lost my place. Now, Onan knew that the offspring wouldn't be his, and when he went into his brother's wife, he spilled his seed on the ground, lest it should give offspring to his brother. So here he's done something evil, right? He's basically, I would say this is a weird kind of adultery, right? The thing in verse 10 here, it says, the thing which he did was evil in the Lord's sight, and he killed him also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house until Shelah, my son, is grown up. For he said, lest he also die like his brothers. Tamar went and lived in her father's house. After many days, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died, Judah was comforted and went up to his sheep shearers in Timnah, he and his friend Hirah the Adulamite. Tamar was told, "Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." She took off the garments of her widowhood and covered herself with her veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gate of Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah, for she saw his wife. So Judah also isn't doing what, right? Onan didn't do what he was supposed to. Judah also isn't doing what he's supposed to. Judah is supposed to give her his youngest son as a husband, and he hasn't done it. So she's going to get what's hers, right? She is owed a son, and she's going to get it. So in verse 15, when Judah saw her, he thought that she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her by the way and said, Please come, let me come into you. For he didn't know. She said, What will you give me that you may come into me? He said, I will send you a young goat from the flock. She said, Will you give me a pledge until you send it? He said, What pledge will I give you? She said, Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. He gave them to her and came into her, and she conceived by him. Now, your signet, your cord, and your staff that is in your hand, that's a lot of ID right there, right? Just a signet ring would be ID enough. But the signet, the cord, the staff in his hand, she takes all his ID, basically. She arose in verse 19 and went away and put off her veil from her and put on the garments of her widowhood. Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, but he didn't find her. The Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, but he didn't find her. Then he asked the men of her place, saying, Where is the prostitute that was at Enaim by the road? They said, turned to Judah and said, I haven't found her. And also the men of the place said, There has been no prostitute here. Judah said, Let her keep it, lest we be shamed. Behold, I sent this young goat, and you haven't found her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the prostitute. Moreover, behold, she is with child by prostitution. Judah said, Bring her out and let her be burnt. You know, this is kind of like the story with Jesus and the young woman caught in adultery, isn't it? Where all the men of the village say, Now look, we have to stone her to death because she's been caught in prostitution. And Jesus just says, You know what? If you haven't ever hired a prostitute, go ahead and cast the first stone. That's not really what he says, but it's what he's implying. And not one man, the oldest men first leave all the way down to the youngest, because not one of them can say that they've never done it. Not one of them can hold themselves to the standard that they're holding the woman that they are insisting needs to be killed for her sinful ways. Well, here Judah does it. He says, Bring her out and let her be burnt. When she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I am with child by the man who owns these. She also said, Please discern whose these are, the signet and the cords and the staff. Judah acknowledged them and said, She is more righteous than I, because I didn't give her to Shelah, my son. So here Judah admits his fault. Notice no one insists that he be burned. The hypocrisy is just left there. on the table. But that's the kind of book that the Bible is. It invites us to see that double standard, and it just leaves us uncomfortable with it. I love that about these stories in the Torah. So before we move on, does anyone have any questions? You go ahead and just type them in the chat. I'm going to keep reading here a bit. Let's see. All right. It says in verse 27, in the time of her travail, behold, twins were in her womb. When she travailed, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this came out first. As he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, why have you made a breach for yourself? Therefore, his name was called Perez. Oops. Excuse me a moment. I'm looking up the footnote. Perez means breaking out. Afterward, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah, which means brightness or scarlet. So I see I've got a couple people watching, but no questions so far. So go ahead and type any questions you have into the chat, and I'll answer them. Or if you have any comments, if you want to tell me how screwed up of a story this is, because, I mean, honestly, it is. That's, I think, one of the most beautiful things about the Torah. It doesn't shy away from difficult subjects. It doesn't shy away from moral ambiguity, nor does it give us clear-cut answers, right? There are no heroes. Judah is not the hero of this story. If anything, Tamar is. Because there are no real heroes in Scripture, except maybe Jesus. And he's the exception, not the rule. We can see that all through the Torah. All right, so Genesis chapter 39, we get back to the story of Joseph. And we're going back in time now. Joseph is 17. He's just been sold as a slave in Egypt, right? It says in verse 1, Joseph was brought down to Egypt. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's, I hate this translation. It says officer. He's a eunuch. So in Hebrew, he's a saris. And being genderqueer, this is a word very close to my heart. I'm also a saris. This is something that I get. Potiphar, a eunuch of Pharaoh's court, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the hand of the Ishmaelites that had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. Joseph found favor in his sight. He ministered to him, and Potiphar made him an overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. From the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The Lord's blessing was on all that he had, in the house and in the field. He left all that he had in Joseph's hand. He didn't concern himself with anything except for the food which he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. After these things, his master's wife set her eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." Now, I want you to notice something. Eunuchs traditionally are thought to not have wives, right? It seems odd that a saras, a eunuch, has a wife, because in Roman times, eunuchs were typically assigned to duties in the temple. Like they might be watching over temple virgins, um, in which case they were expected to be chaste. But not all eunuchs were. In fact, some, like this eunuch, is assigned a role in Pharaoh's court. And what that tells us is he's not a celibate eunuch because he's not a religious eunuch, right? He's not a eunuch who works in the temple. So this is someone who's expected to not have children. He is someone who Pharaoh expects his legacy is his work. He's not going to have children. So his legacy will never be his children. He will never put his children before his work. He'll never consider, he'll never be divided in his loyalty between the good of Pharaoh and the kingdom or the good of his children, right? This is a man that Pharaoh can trust just unwaveringly. So that's the point of a eunuch in ancient times. They weren't necessarily celibate. They weren't necessarily single. They were necessarily castrated. So that does tell us something about this type of officer, though in later times, the word saras didn't necessarily mean the word saras didn't necessarily mean that the person was castrated either. It referred to the office. But that didn't happen until the time of the Greeks. So when the Torah was being written, saras still would have referred to someone who had been castrated. So it is still kind of strange that he has a wife, but not terribly. All right. So in verse 8, it says, "But Joseph refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, my master doesn't know what is with me in the house, and he has put all that he has into my hand. No one is greater in this house than I am, and he has not kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife.'" I'm just going to let those sirens pass by a moment. There we go. "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So Joseph is very his loyalty is not only to his master but also to God. He sees lying with his master's wife not only betraying not only betraying God but also his master. And that is really the point of the previous story, right? In the previous story, we saw Judah talking to his sons about what God wants, about what God expects. Because these things are in the Torah, they're in Leviticus. And so Judah expects his sons to uphold the law, but he himself, doesn't have the balls to do it. Here we have a story of Joseph facing the same temptation almost. And here he refuses the sin that Judah that Judah really failed to, you know. So here it says, he left his garment in her hand and ran outside. So here, just like Judah, Joseph has left something identifying of his behind. In verse 13, it says, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had run outside, she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, behold, he has brought a Hebrew in to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. When he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment by me and ran outside. She laid up his garment by her until his master came home. She spoke to him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought to us came in to me to mock me. And I lifted up my voice and cried. He left his garment by me and ran outside. So just like before, we have someone being framed. In this case, for something they didn't do, though. In verse 19, it says, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, this is what your servant did to me, his wrath was kindled. Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in custody. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So just like before, I'm going to stop here and ask if anyone has questions. Go ahead and type them in the chat on the side. If you're just joining us, we start at 5 o'clock California time on every Wednesday. We have Bible study, so do come and join us for that. If you're wondering why I'm staring down and not like into the camera, it's because the chat is down here. I keep waiting for questions. So go ahead and type whatever questions or comments you have. You know, there are, of course, no obvious questions here. The Bible is a very deep book with a lot of different layers of meaning. We can take these things literally, we can take them figuratively. There's a lot of myth and fairy tale to some of these stories. You know, I think we're probably going to be getting into the realm of fairy tale here pretty soon. And that really excites me, to be honest. I love when the Bible is less literal. All right, so I think I've killed enough time. Let's keep moving. It says in verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in custody. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. The keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in prison. Let's see. Yes, I agree. You know, here we have a story of someone who, you know, we have a contrast between Judah and Joseph, and we see that Joseph is favored in the Lord's sight because he's doing what God wants of him. And this is a time before the law is given, so it comes not by Joseph knowing all the laws of the Lord and what the Lord expects, but by his faith in God. So In verse 23, the keeper of the prison didn't look after anything that was under his hand because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it prosper. So this kind of tells us what it's like to live by faith. Joseph is trusted by everyone that he works for because of his faith. I think when I read this, I think that Joseph must, I think he must talk about his faith a lot. I think he must be very optimistic. I think he's the type of person that when he faces trouble, he has a plan. You know, when we read about Jacob, when we read about Jacob's sons in the previous chapters, they're very crafty people. And I expect that of Joseph as well. But I think here what it's showing us is that Joseph is not only crafty, but he knows how to live by faith. And that he has those two things, that he is both very capable and also very obedient and very trusting of God, that he's really able to prosper that way. So, all right, let's move on to chapter 40 now. After these things, the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Sometimes I notice that the same word is being translated two different ways, and it bothers me. Chief cupbearer and butler are the same person. He put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he took care of them. They stayed in prison many days. They both dreamt a dream, each man his dream, in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were bound in the prison. Joseph came in to them in the morning and saw them, and saw that they were sad. He asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" They said to him, "We have dreamt a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it." Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Please tell it to me." Now, Joseph, up to this point, we see his dreams back in the land of Canaan, right? We see him interpreting his own dreams. And we don't really see that until now. He hasn't interpreted anyone else's dreams until now. But he also doesn't take credit for this ability. He says, isn't that God's power? You know, if you were to go to, if you wanted your dreams interpreted, you wouldn't just go to some prisoner. You wouldn't just go to, you wouldn't go to someone who happens to be spiritual. You would go to the temple, right? You'd go to the pagan temple there in Egypt, and you would have them interpret, but they're stuck in prison. They can't have anyone interpret their dreams. So whatever meaning there is to them, it's just a mystery because they don't follow Joseph's God, the God of everything and everywhere. They follow gods of this little place somewhere, and they have to be able to get to that God's temple if they're going to have their dreams interpreted. But Joseph doesn't have those restrictions. He says, it belongs to God. Just trust me with this. The chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream, behold, a vine was in front of me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand." Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. You will give Pharaoh's cup into his hand the way you did when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well with you." Now, here's that craftiness that his family is so well known for. "Please show kindness to me and make mention of me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this house. For indeed, I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also was in my dream, and behold, 3 baskets of white bread were on my head. In the uppermost basket, there were all kinds of baked foods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." Joseph answered, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off of you and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from off you." On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants. He must have gotten another baker for it. And he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker amongst his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer didn't remember Joseph, but forgot him. Ooh. Poor Joseph. So this reminds me of the book of Daniel, right? Daniel was also an interpreter of dreams. And when Daniel interpreted dreams, he would receive word of the dream from not Pharaoh, from the king. And the king would tell him his dream, and then Daniel would go pray about it, sleep on it, and then he went back and would tell Pharaoh, actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm remembering that wrong. So what the king told Daniel was nothing. He would not tell Daniel the dream. So Daniel said, "Give me a day then." And Daniel went and prayed and slept. And then he went back to the king and said, "All right, this is the dream, and this is its interpretation." So there's this long history here of interpreting dreams as part of serving God. And we're not told that either of these two people is a prophet. We're not told that there's anything particularly special about them, but they serve God faithfully, and that's why they can do this. You know, they have faith and they're doing what God expects of them. So when they receive signs, when they receive visions, they know what they are. All right, let's move on. Chapter 41. At the end of 2 full years, Pharaoh dreamt, and behold, he stood by the river. Behold, 7 cattle came up out of the river. They were sleek and fat, and they fed in the marsh grass. Behold, 7 other cattle came up after them out of the river, ugly and thin. and stood by the other cattle on the brink of the river. The ugly and thin cattle ate up the 7 sleek and fat cattle. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamt a second time, and behold, 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, healthy and good. Behold, 7 heads of grain, thin and blasted with the east wind. That is the wind blowing hot because it's coming over land, right? The west wind comes from the ocean. The east wind goes overland. Sprung up after them, the thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. In the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all of Egypt's magicians and wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now, it's important to note that our God is El Shaddai, God Almighty, El Elyon, the God of gods, the God above all gods. And this is the point that's being made here. That all of the magicians, all of the wise men, they serve these other gods, but they can't answer the dream. Why? Because Joseph hasn't been dealt with faithfully yet. So God sends the dream, God sends the interpretation, but he won't send it through their gods. In verse 9, then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults today. Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard with the chief baker. We dreamt a dream in one night, he and I. Each man dreamt according to the interpretation of his dream. There was with us a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. He interpreted to each man according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it was. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. He shaved himself, changed his clothing, and came in to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamt a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I just want to point out something before we get too far along. Joseph, the phrase, it says, he came into him. That's the same phrase that's being used for Judah and Tamar. It's the exact same phrase, in fact. And with Judah and Tamar, it's being used as a euphemism. Here, it's supposedly being used literally, but it's also the same phrase, and it's meant to draw our minds back to that story. In fact, it's meant to draw our minds back to the story of begetting, the story of every begetting in the book of Genesis so far. But why? Why do these parts of the story need that little reminder? Why are we being asked to remember that? It could use another phrase, but it doesn't, right? It could use any other phrase, but it doesn't. It uses that one, and it does it repeatedly. So this is clearly intentional. But I'm just going to leave you with that thought, maybe in the back of your mind. Why does God want us to think about? Why does the author want us to think about, let's just say, Judah and Tamar in this moment? Maybe someone can answer that for me in the chat. if they think of it. All right, verse 16. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, "It isn't in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." So I want you to notice this. With prophets, they don't take credit for their prophecy, right? Joseph doesn't interpret the dream. He is a speaker for God's interpretation of the dream. And if God doesn't give him an interpretation, guess what? He doesn't have one. As crafty as Joseph is, that's not going to get him out of this situation anyways. So if God doesn't answer the question, Joseph can't. And that's the role of a prophet. That's why it tells us in the prophets that if a prophet prophesies and it doesn't come to pass, you stone the prophet, because that is not a prophet of God. Because that prophet, maybe they spoke for God initially, but they're not doing it anymore. So they're a liar. All right. It isn't in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Verse 17, Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, "In my dream, behold, I stood on the brink of the river, and behold, 7 fat and sleek cattle came up out of the river. They fed in the marsh grass, and behold, 7 other cattle came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for ugliness. The thin," and my Bible wants to freeze here. Here we go. "The thin and ugly cattle ate up the first 7 fat cattle, and when they had eaten them up, it couldn't be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ugly, as at the beginning. So I awoke. I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 heads of grain, withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads of grain. I took it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me." Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dream of Pharaoh is one. What God is about to do, he has declared to Pharaoh. The 7 good cattle are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. The dream is one. The 7 thin and ugly cattle that came up after them are 7 years, and also the 7 empty heads of grain, blasted with the east wind. They will be 7 years of famine. That is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt are coming. 7 years of famine will arise after them, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will not be known in the land by reason of the famine which follows, for it will be very grievous. The dream was doubled to Pharaoh because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look for a discreet and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt." You know, when I read this, the 7 years of prosperity, the 7 years of famine, I think of corporate greed, right? We had, years of plenty in the 90s and in the early 2000s, and then the stock market crashed. Then we had the recession, and we had years where we forgot there ever was plenty. But you know what? Those guys on Wall Street kept doing just fine. and they're still doing just fine. But we can't make ends meet now. The common person can't make ends meet because we can't remember those years of plenty. And this is God's will, what we're about to see. Not what has happened, not what we expect to happen. That Pharaoh will just hoard it all, sell it to other countries, put the gold in his treasury, and his people will starve, but whatever. Can always get more people once there's another good year, right? But Pharaoh listens to Joseph's advice because God doesn't forget people. God doesn't turn away, and God does not neglect our lives. In verse 34, it says, "Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint overseers over the land, and take up the fifth part of the land of Egypt's produce." That's 20%, all right? In the 7 plenteous years. So that means that after 7 years, they have, I think that's 140% of 1 year's production. That's not a lot to get them through 7 years, really. But if those 7 years are 7 years of nothing, they're not going to make it. But what we know is that this famine then is not going to be so severe that there's no food. It's going to be so severe that there's not enough food, right? We can tell that just from the math. All right, verse 35, "Let them gather all the food of these good years that come, and store grain under the hand of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food will be to supply the land against the 7 years of famine, which will be in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish through the famine." The thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Because God has shown you all this, there is no one so discreet and wise as you. You shall be over my house. All my people will be ruled according to your word. Only in the throne I will be greater than you." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in robes of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. He made him ride in the second chariot which he had. They cried before him, bow the knee." He set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh. Without you, no man shall lift up his hand or his foot in all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath Paneah. He gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, as a wife. Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. In the 7 plenteous years, the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He stored food in every city from the fields around that city. Joseph laid up grain as the sand of the sea, very much, until he stopped counting, for it was without number. To Joseph, now, before I move on to verse 50, it emphasizes how much grain he's gathered. And I kind of wonder if maybe Joseph has overgathered. He said to Pharaoh to gather 1/5, but it sounds like there's a lot more than that, right? It says that the grain is like the sands on the sea. So perhaps they have overgathered. Perhaps the math doesn't really tell us the whole story, right? All right. So as I'm moving on, once again, any comments or questions, go ahead, type those into the chat. If you're just joining us, we start at 5 p.m. California time every Wednesday for Bible study. So come join us and ask any questions you have. I'm more than happy to answer, and we can discuss them in the chat as well. All right, verse 50. To Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Verse 53. The 7 years of plenty that were in the land of Egypt came to an end. The 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. The famine was over all the surface of the earth. Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. The famine was severe in the land of Egypt. All countries came into Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe in all the earth. Now, I want you to notice something. When it says the famine was severe in all the earth, does it mean that literally? Can everyone on earth make it to Egypt to buy bread? Not really. Do you think people are coming all the way from China to Egypt to get bread? Do you think that people from South Africa are crossing the Congo to get there? It doesn't seem plausible, does it? You know, how about all those people in Ireland? Are they getting in their canoes and going across the channel and, making the trek? Not really. So here we see this phrase, the famine was severe in all of the earth. And it's just like the Noah story. The flood flooded all of the earth. It doesn't mean it literally. So here we have the phrase used the same way, twice in the same book, written by the same author. If it doesn't mean it literally here, it doesn't mean it literally there either. There's a certain amount of hyperbole to the Bible, a certain amount of exaggeration. The famine was severe in all of the earth. Yeah, well, it was as severe as anyone had ever traveled or could. Perhaps people were coming all the way from Babylon, but they probably weren't coming all the way from India, right? So that's where we're going to stop for today. Next week, we'll pick up in chapter 42. Before we go, does anyone have any questions or comments? Once again, next week, we'll meet at 5 o'clock. So read chapter 42, read ahead, bring your questions, bring your comments. And if you just passionately disagree with what I'm throwing out here, definitely tell me. this is not the type of discussion where only one side is considered. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me, tell me what you believe, because ultimately what you believe is what matters, not what I tell you. So we got a few more minutes before we wrap up. I just want to thank everyone who's in the chat. Thank you for coming today. If you feel like joining us again, there's church on Sunday evenings, also at 5 o'clock from 5 to 6. So come worship with us. The sermon series this week is on the mythological creatures of Scripture. And this week it's going to be about angels and demons. As we wrap up all these spooky creatures of the Bible, you might have a picture in your head of what angels and demons are like in the Bible. And what I can tell you is that you're probably thinking, what you're thinking of probably comes from Dante's Inferno, or it comes from certain early church fathers. Thanks, Minerva. I'll see you Sunday. So, join us Sunday and let's have some of those myths debunked. That's why we're here, right? We want to hear the word of the Lord. So, thanks for coming, and I'll see you next week. God bless.